moments to allow all of this evening's attendees to join the session. It takes a couple of moments for everyone to gain access to the Zoom webinar link. So I'll be checking back in about 30 seconds or so. Thanks. Hi, everyone. For those of you just joining, just waiting a couple of moments for everyone that's joined the webinar to gain access. So we'll just be starting in a couple of moments. Thank you. All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Shazia Vlahos, and I'm the Chief of Communications for the Toronto Catholic School Board, and I will be this evening's moderator. I will be reviewing the comments as they come in via Zoom as well as on YouTube, and I will be directing them to our panelists, who I will be introducing shortly. As most of you hopefully know, today is our second budget virtual town hall. We did have one last night, which focused on students. We had about approximately 200 viewers yesterday, which we're really happy to hear about. Today, the virtual town hall is themed around staffing. So please, if you were joining us yesterday, you know the drill. If you're joining us today for the first time, in order to submit your questions, if you are joining through the Zoom webinar, at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button, and you just need to click that, and then you can type your question and I will see it. And if you're joining us on YouTube, in the comment section, you can type your question, and my team is monitoring that, and we'll also be able to then direct your questions to the appropriate panelists. Wanted to let everyone know we have one more town hall after tonight. That is on April 20th, and the theme for that one is facilities. So please, if you can, join us April 20th as well. For all of the sessions, they are being recorded. So if you've missed it or know anyone that's missed it, you can go on to our main webpage and you'll see our budget consultation page. And you click that and you'll have access to all of the recorded sessions. Want to also let everyone know that our budget survey is opening tomorrow, and we will be sharing that directly with our staff, with our families, and with our stakeholders. That will be open until April 30th, so please look out for that as well. So I'm going to now turn it over to Dr. Brendan Brown, the Director of Education, who's going to begin this evening by leading us in a prayer.
Thanks so much, Shazia, and good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. As Shazia said, this is our second town hall, and we're delighted that so many people joined us last night. We're happy to answer those questions as best we can and try to provide as much feedback. And we want to gather that from you as well. So really appreciate that you're taking the time to share your feedback with us. We know that there's so much going on in the evenings with work and the different commitments. So the fact that you're with us is something that we really appreciate. Your questions are really integral to helping us to inform our budget process. So thanks for being here tonight. As we begin, as I've been invited to do, I'd like to begin our evening in prayer. So given that tonight's town hall theme is about our staff, I'd like to share a prayer with Toronto Catholic District School Board staff, particularly in mind. So please join me in the sign of our faith. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Loving God, bless our teachers and bless our school staff. Thank you for calling them to work with our children. Give them a spirit of grace and compassion. Bless them with strength and with sympathy so that they can support our students on their learning journey. Bless our administrators and our central staff with the guidance and the skills to perform their tasks. And may all staff know and feel the deep gratitude that we have of their students, of their colleagues, and particularly of our parent guardian community. Be with all of us at Toronto Catholic as we approach these final months of the school year. We ask all of this in the name of Jesus Christ, who died on the cross for our sins. Amen. All saints, pray for us. In the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. And now we have a very special land acknowledgement. We have a special video from our ELP students at St. James Catholic School.
Apologies, just give us a couple of moments while we click that link.
Deep respect for Indigenous people in Canada. We acknowledge that all Toronto's Catholic districts will properties are situated upon traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat people. We also acknowledge covered by Treaty 13 is held by Mississauga of Credit First Nation, and Toronto is subject. This was one spoon covenant. We also recognize the contributions and dream present of all First Nations, Métis and Inuit peoples.
That was a great way to start our town hall. And though today is about staff, we're always thinking about our students and listening to our students as the land acknowledgement, listening to those students pronouncing Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat, just amazing students that are real representative of our board, and we're very, very proud of them. And as we're here tonight to talk about staff, we know that our staff are proud of them as well. So thank you for that land acknowledgement. Just before we move on, I just want to acknowledge that this past year, we faced a lot of challenges in the light of this pandemic. And so as we prepare tonight for the year ahead, we understand that there's a lot of questions. So tonight, we will do our best to work to provide families with an understanding of the upcoming year's budget, answer your questions, and then outline any impacts and possible impacts on our students, on our staff for the upcoming year, because that's what the evening is about. So we look forward to engaging with you, and thanks once again for joining us tonight.
Thanks so much, Director Brown. So I'm going to move on to introducing our panelists for this evening, who will be available to respond to the questions that we are getting in real time, as well as the questions we've received in advance. So Director Brown will be joined by Dan Koenig, the Associate Director of Academic Affairs, Steve Camacho, who is the Acting Associate Director of Facilities, Business and Community Development, Paul DeCock, the Comptroller of Business Services, Adrian Delamora, Superintendent of Human Resources. Want to give a special shout out and acknowledgement to Adrian for joining us today on his birthday. Also Maria Meehan, Superintendent of Special Services, who is here and they're all ready to respond to your questions this evening. So before we get started with your questions, I'd like to invite one of our panelists, Steve Camacho, the Acting Associate Director, who's going to walk us through the budget process. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody, and just give me a few moments while I set up the presentation. So good evening, everybody, and thanks again for the time this evening and for joining us today as we go through our discussion around the budget. Again, this is our second town hall focused primarily on staffing this evening. So I'll just go through the process, and here's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk a little bit about what the budget development process is, what it's all about, and what are the steps we take to develop a budget year over year. We're also going to talk a little bit about what the cost and revenue pressures are this year that we're seeing going into next year. We're going to talk a little bit about what the possible impacts on staffing would be, and then we're going to go into questions and answers. So how's the budget developed? Really, the budget starts at the top of the cycle here. It's a cycle every year that we go through. And it starts by gathering information about things that we know are happening. So getting a sense for what our costs might be for next year, getting a sense for what are the revenue impacts, making some assumptions and estimates on those activities, and trying to learn also what the ministry has coming for us, as most of our funding comes from the Ministry of Education. So that's the process we're going through right now. It's an ongoing process, and we started that process back in January. Now, as we're getting into the March and April timeframe, we started our budget consultations, and we do our stakeholder consultations on the budget. And this is the point where we start getting into opportunities to speak to our various different stakeholders, that be parents, students, union partners, and getting feedback even for the general public around what's important in the budget for the following year for those various different groups. Usually around the end of this time period with consultation is when we usually get the Ministry of Education announcement on funding. We're anticipating this year to see that announcement sometime in the next week or so, we hope. Sometimes it's a little bit later, but we hope to see it in the next week. And that will give us a much better indication of what the government's priorities are for the following year. Then once we've had all our information from the consultations, from the information we've gathered, and from the ministry announcement, we actually take the time to develop the what we call the draft budget. And we spend most of April and May doing that, and we bring forward a draft budget to the Board of Trustees in mid-May for their feedback. And at this point, the Board of Trustees would be making formal motions or changes to the budget based on what they believe are the priorities for next year. And then based on that feedback, we take that information back, we make changes to the budget, and then we bring back a final budget for approval of the Board of Trustees in mid-June. And then our final step really is to submit the budget to the Ministry of Education. That's due on June 30th. And then the budget year would start in the same time with the school year, September 1st. So the budget we're planning for today is really about next year, September onwards. So you might have heard the term the balanced budget, and what exactly does that mean? So in its simplest terms, balanced budget really means balancing the revenues, the money we're making, versus our expenses, the money we're spending on various different activities. And so from the revenue side, we have a number of different sources of revenue. The biggest one is what we call our GSNs, or grants for student needs. This is where most of our funding comes from. This is the grants that the government of Ontario provides us through the Ministry of Education. We also have some revenue from other activities such as fees, maybe activity fees or fees for trips and so forth at the school level. We have some international students that pay full tuition, if you will, from that perspective. So there's some fees there. We also have revenue from things like permits and leases and so forth from using our buildings when they're not being used for school activities. And there's a few other revenue sources in there, but those are the big ones. On the expense side, we have our instructional expense. So the expenses to run the instructional program, whether that be an elementary school, a secondary school, our special education expenses. It's basically everything to run the day-to-day programs within the TCDSB. We have expenses to run and maintain our buildings. So cleaning our buildings, but also repairing them, bringing them up to getting them up to speed, replacing windows and doors and so forth, are kind of part of the overall general maintenance of buildings expenses. We have some expenses in the governance and administration side of things, which is really focused on the overall view of the board. So this also include things like central services such as HR, IT, payroll, and so forth. And we also have transportation expenses. So the school bus to get kids to and from schools across our system. There might be a few other expense categories in there, but these are kind of the big ones. And really, a balanced budget means, again, balancing those two things out. Those two sides have to equal. And it's actually a legal requirement for school boards to do that. It's not really an option for us to run a deficit where we're spending more than is coming in, or the other way around, a significant surplus where we're spending a lot less, or we're planning to spend a lot less than is coming in. So the idea here is to balance and maximize all the dollars we have towards programs and services. I think it's also important to note that the balanced budget typically doesn't include reserves. So we're not, dipping into, we have a pocket of money, which I'll explain in a sec, called reserves that we have for various different activities. That's typically not included in what we talk about when we talk about a balanced budget. So what does a typical budget look like for the TCDSB? And in fact, you can almost say this is a typical budget for most school boards. So if you take a typical year, you would see about 81% of our expenditures get spent on the instructional expenses. So again, that would be everything from teacher salaries, anything to do with running the programs at the school, all the sort of instructional expenses that it would cost for us to run a school program in any one of our schools comes out of that instructional expense. So a significant portion, the majority of our funds goes towards school programming. About 9% of our budget goes towards building maintenance, buildings and maintenance. So that would be cleaning our schools, so custodial staff and so forth come out of that, cleaning supplies, and snow removal and so forth, but also maintenance for our schools. So again, fixing windows, doors, roofs, and things of that nature. About 3% of our expenses goes towards student transportation, so getting kids to and from school, primarily in the elementary panel. Another 3% goes to what we call school-generated activities. So again, things would be like field trips or other kinds of extracurricular activities that the school receives money from, and then also expends out usually on an equal basis. About 2.5% of our funds, of our expenditures, goes to governance administration. Again, those are things like central administration, but also IT and HR and those kinds of other activities. Then about 1.5% goes to what we call other, which doesn't really fall into any category. And an example of this might be insurance. There's also a couple of other buckets of money. Actually, before I go on to that equals a typical budget for us is about $1.5 billion a year. That would be our operating budget for the year. We also get a couple of different buckets of money based on different programs and projects. So we often get a project-specific money for a new building or an addition, or daycare, or something to that effect. Those usually come on again, per project basis from the government, and they can't be used for any other purpose. We also have sometimes project initiatives from the government for other purposes. Again, usually one-time funding, special initiatives that the government will give us funds to expend. Again, they typically for a year or two, and then when the project is done, it's done. So what are we seeing leading into next year? So next year we are seeing a number of pressures, both on the revenue side, so revenues decreasing and cost increasing as well. So based on what we've heard from the ministry so far, and again, we're still waiting for the ministry announcement, so that's going to be key for us as we go through the process. But in our discussion so far with the ministry, we've been told to expect, quote unquote, a normal budget. So we believe that means that a lot of the one-time COVID-related funding that we receive both from the provincial and federal governments won't be there. So that's going to be some money that has been taken off the table. I'll also note that there's expenses that will be taken off the table as well. So we typically, for example, devices, computers, we've spent that money on those devices. We wouldn't have to buy more necessarily because we've already spent the funds. So that's the one-time funding. But we're also seeing revenue pressures from loss of students. So this year, and I'll go into that in a little bit more detail in the next few slides, but we've lost some students from the previous year, around 4% of our students. So we have a revenue pressure this year that equates to about $46.7 million. And again, there's a question mark there because we're not quite sure What that means exactly, because we're still waiting for the government announcement, but our estimate is about that. And that again goes from a declining enrollment, both domestically from students and also international students that have not come over. And then we have some cost pressures as well. So we have some additional transportation costs. We have to roll in the bell time optimization, or the canceling of the bell time optimization, and also some increased utility costs. And then on the contingency reserve, we have about $7.8 million. Again, we wouldn't typically use this to balance the budget. This is something we would keep on the side in case we had some in-year challenges, as we did this year, and make those adjustments. So there's a small little reserve there, but it's not really meant to balance the overall budget. So and there might be wondering, how are we going to get to a balanced budget if we have all these pressures? And really, there typically is a way to a balanced budget. And I've already mentioned once before that we're going to be looking at reducing our costs. So we don't expect the same level of cost this year, next year, as we did this year, because a lot of things have already been expended. So for an example, we spent quite a bit of money on HEPA air filters in the classrooms. Now those filters are there. We don't expect a lot of costs to add more because they're already there. We're shrinking in enrollment, so we're gonna have to be right-sizing staff to match our enrollment levels. That's another area where our expenditures will go down. We're gonna be, of course, looking for other efficiencies in programs to see if we can deliver the programs in a more efficient way and expend less. And of course, again, the other key element here is what the Ministry of Education funding announcement will glean for us, and understanding that to see if there's any additional revenues to support various different programs. So what are the possible impacts on staffing? Now, I'll underline the possible part here, because again, we don't know what we don't know yet. So we're still waiting for that Ministry of Education announcement. That's going to be a key element to everything. We're expecting right now around 3,500 less students than we did, I guess, 2 years ago now. So this year we lost about 2,700 students, and we're expecting another 800 students to go down, so for a total of around 3,500 students. And the reason why I'm giving you a 2-year number is because this year, from a staffing perspective, we didn't shrink staffing to match that decrease in enrollment. We kept staffing levels at the same level as we had planned for at the beginning of the year, in order to manage the situation with COVID. But the following year, we're expecting to have to make those adjustments to match the staffing levels, to match the enrollment levels in our schools. We will be following regulated class sizes, of course, as well as collective agreements. So we're still going to be within those. We're not planning to make we're not planning to be over those elements in any way. And then finally, our enrollment projections are exactly that, they're projections. So whatever the actual enrollment is in September, if it's higher, we'll be adding more staff to accommodate, and if it's lower, we'll be making those adjustments as well. But we'll actually staff for actual enrollment in September as we do every year. There's still other things that not to be determined. Again, waiting for more information, but we're looking at different possible areas from flexible funding. So not some of our funds are particularly directed towards certain things. So for an example, special education funding has to be directed towards special education expenses, but there are other parts of our budget that are a little more flexible, and we're looking at different ways to flex things. And this is part of the reason why we go through our consultation process. We're looking at, of course, central support services and what we can do there to make them more efficient. But those also might be other efficiencies. So, for example, delaying some investments and trying to make things work that way as well. So a lot of things still to be determined. Again, waiting on more information from the ministry is a key next step for us. So in terms of next steps in the budget process itself, we've done our staffing projection that was discussed at the board a couple of weeks ago. We'll continue through our staffing process for the following year. We're going to continue to collect information about things we know and things we don't know. We're going to try to find more information about. So it's going through the budget process as we normally do. We're going through our stakeholder consultations right now. So starting with our budget town hall yesterday, another one today, of course. We'll have another one coming up later in April. There's also other activities as part of the consultation process. Again, we're waiting for the ministry announcement. And we're also going to continue to explore different ideas to generate revenue or look for other efficiencies. Again, we'll bring a draft budget to the Board of Trustees in May, and finally a final budget to the board for approval in June to start the following year. So I think that's about it. And I think oh, sorry, one more slide. On the consultation side of things, I guess it's also very important to understand our consultation process, and it's very important to us and it's part of the process. So as we do every year, we'll have a robust survey that's going out, I believe tomorrow. We have our virtual town halls, which I've discussed. We've got our budget consultation website, which is tcdsb.org/budget consult. And there's several opportunities throughout the next couple of months in the boardroom as we present different reports, and also opportunities for the public to delegate to the Board of Trustees to hear your voices around the budget. So I think with that, I think we'll move on to questions. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks so much, Steve. As Steve said, we're going to move into the Q&A portion of this evening's session. So for those of you just joining us, as a reminder, if you're on the webinar link, if you go to the bottom, there's a Q&A option. If you click that, you can type out a question and it'll make its way to the team here for us to direct it to the appropriate staff as a panelist. And then if you're joining us on the YouTube stream, in the comment section, please type out your question and we'll also be able to direct those to the appropriate staff here. So I'm going to do my best to get through all the questions that we have right now. I know we received a bunch in advance, so we're going to start with those. And I think coincidentally, the first one here is going to be directed to the birthday boy, Adrian. The question is, given the current budget reality posed by COVID-19, does the board still anticipate substantial hiring occurring for permanent teaching positions in the secondary panel in the coming months and next year? Are there a large pool of experienced young LTO teachers who are interested in taking the next step in their careers?
Thank you for the question, Shazia, and for the warm birthday wishes. I would say that I'll begin by saying that I care deeply about our talented occasional teachers, and I thank them for their commitment and courage to teach. The TCDSB HR department is always looking for a sustained recruitment effort, and in fact, our occasional teacher roster is larger than it's ever been. This is the time of the year that we engage in enrollment projections, as Mr. Camacho alluded to, and preliminary teacher staffing projections. And we know that if enrollment decreases, then unfortunately staffing will also follow suit, because enrollment drives staffing. At last week's regular board meeting, I publicly stated that at the secondary panel, in light of enrollment decreases, that we'll be facing a decrease of 74.45 secondary teachers, but fortunately that's mitigated by a projected retirement of 95 teachers. So when you have the mitigating factors in play, we do anticipate hiring some of these talented individuals at the secondary panel. My advice to OTs is to stay loyal, to stay informed and focused. We will need your value added and dedication in the field. Many opportunities will present themselves, as unfortunately during a pandemic, we do have a greater incidence of sick leaves, and those will provide opportunities for occasional teachers to move into different assignments as well.
Thanks so much, Adrian. Next question. My child would learn best with an educational assistant in the regular classroom. I've been told they're not available at his school. Why would this be the case? For instance, what factors are involved in deciding the number of EAs that are allocated to a school? I'll give that to you, Maria, please.
Thank you, Shazia. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the very dedicated work that our educational assistants provide in their school environments. And I know they are much appreciated by the students and families and staff that they work with. With respect to the support for students, of course, we acknowledge that support is very reflective of individual student needs. We also know that more support does not always lead to better outcomes. It is really the targeted, appropriate support that is in place to meet the needs of students. So when we look at the classroom, really the individual with the greatest impact on students is the classroom teacher. And part of our work is to continue to build capacity among our teaching staff in order to meet the needs of our very diverse learners with their unique learning needs and styles. And ultimately, the goal of any support that we provide for our students in the form of an educational assistant, for example, is actually to build the child towards the greatest level of independence, where support is not required. In terms of the process of how this support is provided to the system, we look both at the individual child through data that is shared by schools, where they go student by student and share this through a platform that we have access to, and work with our research department to explore that data once it's received. And then we also are looking at a system level. So from the individual child across the full system, and creating a template to apply the resources that we have across the system in a meaningful way to meet the individual needs of students. And beyond that, we also bring the expertise of our chiefs of special services and our assessment and programming teachers, who are intimately familiar with school communities and students, to inform that process. And continued dialogue with the classroom teacher and with the principal around your child's learning is probably the best way to ensure that everyone is keeping informed as to the best and most appropriate supports for children.
Thanks so much, Maria. Next question. With the shift to online learning, I'm concerned about the amount of computer use and screen time. We need more hands-on learning. Does the board plan to introduce technical skills, courses in grades 7 and 8, for example, design and technology and home ec? Over to you, Dan.
Yeah, thanks, Shazia. That's a great question. Obviously, we're very concerned around the amount of time, screen time that students have. We want them to be out. We want them to be active. We do have, mandatory DPA that occurs in our schools, elementary schools. There's a mandatory HPE credit as well that happens at secondary. So yes, we want our kids to be active. We want them off the screens, especially at times, and to increase their learning. Unfortunately, when it comes to design and tech and home economics, those are courses of the past that when I was a teacher, we had them in our elementary schools, and kids would participate those once a week in those activities. We follow the ministry guidelines and the curriculum guidelines. There are no expectations specific to those subject areas any longer in the elementary curriculum. But that doesn't mean that our teachers aren't creative in using some of the hands-on experience. So there's lots of great lessons that I've seen teachers produce, even in baking and cooking, and using math requirements for that. There actually was a school that just recently was developing an outdoor skating rink. So using really experiential learning, hands-on learning, using the expectations that were part of the ministry curriculum, but using them in an experiential learning format. So that's what we're encouraging. We do have an experiential learning resource department. They're available to staff. Many of our staff realize that the hands-on learning is the best way. Teach me, but show me is one of the ways in which we've advocated for our teachers and provided some professional development in that area to access those particular gifts that are available to our students. So thanks, Shazia.
Thanks, Dan. I know we're getting some questions coming in through YouTube, so I'll get to those in just a couple of moments. Still gonna make our way through some of the questions that we received in advance. This one is that there's a couple parts to it. Maria, this question is related to mental health. A year into the pandemic with no end in sight, our kids are struggling, and I'm certain staff are too. Does the board plan to hire more mental health staff and supports? What portion of next year's budget will be allocated to mental health supports and services? Do students have access to these supports if they're learning remotely?
Thank you, Shazia. Certainly, we're all very aware of the impact of the pandemic on our students, on our staff, and on our families. And the board is very committed to continually focusing attention, resources, opportunities for staff learning to address these needs. In terms of mental health staff, it really is an example of it takes a village. And we are working with all of our staff who work with students in terms of understanding those conditions that build resiliency, those conditions that build hope, and also observations of students who may require more than can be offered in a classroom, and making appropriate and timely referrals for mental health supports. These supports are in the form of our mental health team. This is an example of where the board did make a commitment for positions that had originally been funded by the ministry, but then now became permanent positions embedded in our budget. It's also through our school social workers and our school psychologists. We have supports within the school in the form of our CYWs who are supporting students. And then there are teaching staff whose dedicated roles, for example, as guidance teachers or as chaplains within our secondary schools, who are also providing those supports. So I do know that there is that commitment to continue that support and to continue to build capacity among all of our staff members. And with respect to the question about those students learning remotely, absolutely. All of our staff to whom referrals are made are meeting with students and have been since September using virtual tools. Also, we have in-serviced and shared a great deal of information with our staff who are working at St. Anne's Academy in terms of how to create those conditions, even in a virtual classroom, that support mental health and well-being. We also, you will, as a parent of students who are learning remotely, receive newsletters from the principal of the school. And embedded in those newsletters are links for parents as well, as we know that parents are also anxious for information as to how they can support well-being within their homes.
Thanks so much, Maria. I'm going to just jump over to a question we just received on YouTube. We've actually received a number of questions related to this. Will there be both virtual learning and in-person learning offered next year? I'm going to pass that over to Director Brown.
Thanks, Shazia. And yes, it is a popular question that we're certainly fielding a lot ourselves. And we absolutely realize that families want to know as soon as possible what our plans are for next year. We're trying to balance that at the moment right now with making sure that we're making good decisions with the best information we have. So there's a couple things that are outstanding that we're waiting to land before we're going to be able to make an announcement. So number one is the budget. As we talked about, we think that the grants for student needs are going to be announced in the next couple of weeks. So that's going to tell us a little bit more about where we can focus. And the other thing that we're waiting on is the ministry has intimated that there will be some messaging coming out in terms of expectations for next year, whether that be expectations for cohorts or physical distancing or things that they expect to be in place. And that'll allow us to plan a little bit more accurately for next year. Looking into the crystal ball a little bit, if you'll permit me to do so, I would think that next year come September, a lot of September for sure is going to look a little bit like this year. Certainly when it comes to our PPEs, the processes that we put in place, just that sense of caution, because we've actually seen things are working fairly well in our schools in terms of mitigating a risk. We recognize that there's challenges in the community when it comes to COVID, but we are proud of our staff and the way things we've been putting in place. I do think that we've seen things differently this year. We certainly had to pivot so much with our virtual school, with pivoting to remote when required, and just proud of our staff and their ability to do so. I do think that there will be some form of in-person, and I think that there will be probably some options for virtual as well. So details to come, and we look forward to sharing that as soon as possible. The last thing I want to say is that we are really looking forward to being back to close to normal as soon as possible. We recognize when we talk about mental health, how important it is for students to be together, have those connections. And we also realize that some students are thriving in the virtual environment. So we definitely have all plans on the table right now. We're just waiting for a couple of more of these details to be confirmed, and we look forward to sharing soon.
Thanks so much. So next question here. School caretakers have been the greatest unsung heroes during COVID, and there's no end in sight for their work. Does the board have enough funding to cover all the daily enhanced cleaning that's been required during the pandemic? Has funding been increased in the area for next year? Over to you, Steve.
Thanks a lot, Shazia, and thanks for the question. I certainly concur with the comment about the caretaking maintenance staff at our board being the unsung heroes of this pandemic. We don't often hear enough of them. They've been doing an amazing job over the last year, even before that, but in particular over the last year, keeping our schools clean and safe. We often also don't hear that they were actually in the schools throughout when a lot of us were working remotely or learning online. So keeping our buildings operating is an important aspect of the work they do as well. So kudos to them. So in terms of next year, again, we don't have a lot of details yet from the ministry in terms of additional funding or whatnot that would be related to COVID, if any. We certainly want to keep as much as possible the cleaning situation as enhanced as we can leading to next year. That's going to be an important piece because we don't think COVID is going to be completely away in September. It'd be nice if it was, but it's unlikely. So we want to keep that up, but we're still waiting for some more information from the ministry on what we can and can't do. The other thing I'll say too is also important is as the year has gone on, some of the costs for enhanced cleaning, things like PPE, some other supplies have been coming directly from the ministry. We anticipate that that's going to continue into next year. And so those things won't actually bear any costs there. That would just flow from the ministry to the school boards. And that also help the situation in terms of cleaning and keeping the schools safe. So again, more information to come. We certainly think that's a priority area for us. And we want to focus on that into the fall.
Thanks, Steve. Director Brown, we actually just got a follow-up question to the response you just provided. So in the event the board continues to offer online learning next year, how will that be staffed?
So our staffing, first of all, staffing is always done through the number of students that we have. So as Associate Director Camacho talked about in the overview, our main funding source is the amount of students that are enrolled in our system. So for every student, we're funded on a per pupil basis. So when it comes to staffing the virtual, if there was staffing considerations for a virtual school next year, it would most likely be set up in the same way that we would staff any school. So when we have the number of students, and when we have a particular number of students, that generates a teacher that would be in that place. The challenges that we had this year would not be the anticipated challenges moving forward. So the challenges we had this year was setting up for in-person and so many migrating to virtual and then migrating again to virtual. We were really trying hard not to be as disruptive as we could while staffing in the virtual schools. But as we're thoughtful about moving forward into the new year, if we're going to be able to offer opportunities for students to continue to learn in a virtual environment, we would staff those classes the same as we would staff any school class, in that when we have the targeted the numbers per class, we would create a class and that way we would staff it accordingly. So basically the short answer is that any class would be staffed to the current ratio that we would staff an in-person school to. Our ability to do that well in advance staffing process is actually what makes the process reasonable. So yeah, the last thing I would say on that is that, as Associate Director Camacho said, we don't anticipate any extra money this year for the upcoming year. So that's why it's really important to note that our staffing process will be directly tied to our funding. So when we know what the GSN is, then we will be able to know how to staff our schools, because those are directly tied. So hopefully that clarifies.
Thanks so much for that response. How much is spent on professional development for TCDSB staff? Could these expenses be eliminated or reduced? Over to you, Dan.
Yeah, thanks, Shazia. So our professional development funds really come from the ministry, and those funds are usually priority partnership funding that are specific. So we have a math strategy. There's $1.3 million. We receive that total amount from the ministry specifically for our math strategy. It can't be spent for anything else. There's a contract that you sign, and then if you don't utilize money in that math strategy specifically for professional development for teachers, you send it back to the ministry. So there are what they call that envelope. The money is specific, it's provided for a specific reason, and you need to utilize it for that reason. There are some additional budget money that we do have out of our $1.2 billion budget that go to department budgets, central departments. And out of that budget, they do provide some of professional development, say in the music, arts, drama, phys ed. So but that's limited amounts that we have within that. We have looked at previous reductions in those departmental budgets, and we'll be looking at those again, depending upon what the GSN's amounts are going to look like coming from the ministry.
Thanks so much, Dan. There's two questions here that I'm going to group. Adrian, these are for you. The first one here, Adrian, is I heard some school enrollments have dropped quite a bit. Is the board planning for any staff reductions for the upcoming budget year? And is the TCDSB considering any reductions to administrative staff?
Thanks, Shazia. As previously mentioned, enrollment drives staffing, and as Director Brown mentioned, that we're funded on a per pupil basis. So, unfortunately, as enrollment decreases, the board has no choice but to consider staffing reductions subject to legislative requirements and collective agreement caps. So what we're doing is we're staffing according to these legislative and collective agreement parameters and requirements. And yes, unfortunately, some schools and many schools, the secondary panel will face staffing reductions. Our job as stewards of resources, as articulated in our multi-year strategic plan, is to do so as equitably and sensitively as we possibly can, especially with a heightened attention to the breadth of program that we like and pride ourselves on providing to all of our students at all of our secondary schools. So the exercise that HR staff, in conjunction with the budget team and senior staff, is engaging in right now is exactly that. Looking at the reductions, how to soften the edges to ensure that we're providing schools with the staff that they need to provide the breadth of program that they need. The second question, Shazia, was?
Whether the board is considering any reductions in administrative staff.
So I would say that right now that our administrative assignments are very lean. We've done our job in the past to decrease that line. And again, if you look at the allocations in schools, they are quite lean. So I would say that I'm advocating for kind of a status quo in that area with regards to the support and the integral role that those administrators are playing. And I'll use this as an opportunity to publicly acknowledge the work of our principals and vice principals. They are doing exemplary work on a daily basis. And I know and trust that our community and stakeholders value the work that they do.
Thanks so much, Adrian. I know we're getting a lot of questions in our comment section on YouTube, so I'm going to try my best to get to those as soon as possible. Still going through some of the questions that were pre-submitted. Adrian, actually going to keep this next one here for you. Last year's budget referred to non-classroom support resource teachers. What do these teachers do?
Yeah, I'll just reference two very quick aspects of our multi-year strategic plan. That's providing the stewardship of resources and fostering student achievement. And really, those are the reasons behind the non-classroom support resource teachers. They're also referred to as central resource teachers, and they're a grouping of teachers with specific specialized qualifications that provide professional development and support for other teachers. So what they do is they support teachers to enhance their instructional efficacy. And that's one of our jobs as stewards of resources, to use these teachers to support other teachers. And in doing so, by enhancing their instructional efficacy and supporting them, they're going to enhance student achievement and the experience for our students. And so they really go hand in hand. This category also, in addition to targeting areas of need and support in the area of literacy and numeracy, for example, also includes teachers that work in highly specialized settings, such as assessment and programming teachers that support the special education process, or deaf and hard of hearing teachers as well. So at the end of the day, these are teachers teaching teachers and promoting a professional learning environment where teachers learn from and with each other.
Thank you, Adrian. Next question. If the government controls most of the funding and tells TCDSB how to spend it, what's the point of getting feedback on the budget? I'm going to pass that to you, Steve.
Thanks a lot, Shazia, and thanks very much for the question. Certainly, that's a common question. Who do we get? The government does control to some degree the funding elements of that we get from them. So they do things like what we call sweatering the money. An example I gave earlier was around sweatered special education funding. So we have to spend those funds on special education expenses. But there are portions of our budget that are quote unquote flexible, and that we do have the opportunity to move in different areas. And that's why essentially we go through the budgeting process to learn and understand what our stakeholders think are the priority, and for us to make those adjustments throughout the year. Even minor adjustments can sometimes have a big impact on an individual school community and so forth. So it's important for us to go through the process and understand where our priorities are and should be for the following year as we build the budget. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Next question is related to ISP classes. Are ISP classes reflected on need? So the type of classes offered are based on the need for that year. If there are students with autism waiting for a spot in an ISP, autism supports are needed. Over to you, Maria.
Thank you, Shazia. Certainly across the system, we do endeavor to have a variety of programs under the category of ISP, so that would meet the needs of specific learners. Students with autism in particular, there are a variety of learning opportunities for these students, and specific placements would really be very dependent upon the individual student. At this time, students with autism, one of the appropriate placements may be an ISP class, but that might not be always the case. It might be supports within the regular classroom provided by individuals who work as a team. We have an autism team that will go out and work with classroom teachers to, again, to build capacity in order to meet the needs of students with autism. If it is an ISP class, there are a variety actually of ISP classes where we meet the needs of students with autism. Some are specifically for students with autism, and others are other exceptionalities that are present in the students. So for example, a student with a learning disability, or a student alternately who is a student with autism, but also may have multiple exceptionalities. So the review annually of the programs that we have, noting where across the city we have need, noting where we recognize that it might be an opportunity to move a program to meet needs in an area of a city, but that is an annual review. At this time, we do not have a waiting list specifically for autism ISP classes. In fact, we have spaces, but really it is a very individualized conversation with parents, with staff, in anticipation of an IPRC meeting where those placement decisions, one of which could be an ISP class, are made.
Thanks so much. Next question is going to be for Director Brown. Now that the TCDSB has had some experience with staff working from home for an extended period of time, is this something that should be considered to save money?
So certainly the last year has taught us a lot, and especially those of us in education. Education's been done the same way for a long time. And this has been a disruption. And in a lot of ways, disruptions can be positive, can be really move us in different ways. And certainly for us, it's moved forward the way that we think about teaching and learning, where teaching and learning happens, where it can happen, and then how we do it and how we're utilizing the tools, the resources, the creativity to do things in new and different ways. So it's been an unbelievable year of learning, and something that we have, I would say, embraced in Toronto Catholic as we've learned together about how to do things differently. I would say that the experience of remote learning from a business operations perspective, if you're talking about saving money, certainly we've learned lessons about how we can maximize our operational efficiencies, and when it comes to how we use our resources in the most pragmatic way possible during these difficult times. So these lessons will certainly always be on the table. And just, that recognition that our funding is connected to student enrollment. And when we understand what the funding is, that will drive, how we're taking a look at how we could be better, do better, be more efficient. So we're always learning along the way. We're always open to continuing to be better. And certainly this last year has provided some great opportunities for how that might look differently as we think about what do we need to keep moving forward and how do we need to keep moving forward in ways that we've learned over the last year. So the answer to that would be certainly. We certainly are learning, and we certainly look forward to implementing what we've learned.
Thanks so much. I know I'm trying to get through as many questions as possible related to this evening's town hall theme, which is staffing. We did get a question, however, related to a new school. So I am going to pass that over to you, Steve. There were plans for new schools, example, St. Leo Elementary, to be constructed by September 2021. Will the board still be going ahead with the construction of those new schools?
Didn't hit my mute button there. So thanks a lot, Shazia, and I appreciate the question. We certainly get a lot of questions when community around school construction, when communities go through the process, and the lucky few that get a new school or a new addition. St. Louis specifically, my understanding is we're still working through some final steps to get approval to actually start the construction of the school. I still believe that the plan is to start in the fall. I'm not sure if it'll exactly be September, but to start in the fall. But we're all waiting for a few more elements in terms of approvals before we can start that process. So I still think we're on track to what our last update was, and hopefully we'll get that school built as fast as possible.
Thank you. Next question. Will there be any investment in special education and its related staffing? Over to you, Maria.
Thank you, Shazia. Certainly, the board is committed to supporting all of our special education students, and that investment is in the form of human resources, in the form of resources that are used to assist with programming. It's also in the form of professional development for our staff to ensure, again, the building of capacity across the system to meet our special education needs. We know and we've heard that some of our funding is tied to GSNs, and we have some question marks there. But I also know, based on past experience in our board, that our board typically will overspend in the area of special education, and that our board of trustees, when faced with decisions around special education programming, have certainly shown their commitment to this very important work that our board does, and have resisted opportunities to cut in areas related to special education. So it's with great optimism, again, with some questions in mind related to funding, but certainly a tradition and a practice of maintaining those investments in the area of special education.
Thanks, Maria. Next question here is, knowing that the pandemic may be with us for the coming school year, why would the board consider staff cuts if in-person class sizes continue to increase? I'm going to pass that over to Director Brown.
So it's important to keep in mind when we look at what our staffing is going to be like for next year. I might not use the term cuts. I would suggest that what we're committing to is staffing based on what we're funded for. So we are funded per pupil. So the number of students, as we said, the number of students that we have generates the number of teachers that we're funded for. And when we staff our classes, we're committed to staffing based on what the ministry guidelines are and what's in our collective agreements. So for example, in primary, that would be to a maximum of 20 students in grades 1 to 3. It can go up to 25.4 on average in the junior grades. So those numbers, we're not looking to reduce staff. We're actually just looking to staff to the number of students that we have. So a couple of things here. Number one is that, again, we do get our funding from the ministry, and that's based on our enrollment. So when the GSN comes out in the next couple of weeks, we're going to basically know exactly how much funding we're going to receive per pupil. Then we will have the big picture of how much money we have to spend on staffing, and then we will staff our classes up to what those provincial averages are keeping in mind our collective agreements. So we're not looking to cut staff. We're not looking to reduce staff. What we're suggesting is that what we're doing is staffing our classes to the level that we're funded for, which is what the ministry expects us to do. This year, we received extra funding because of the virtual and the ways in which we were had to staff 2 systems. So what the government is basically saying is that extra funding is not continuing. So it's not necessarily us looking to cut, it's just a regular budget coming in that we have to staff in the ways in which we are funded for. So hopefully that helps.
Thank you. I'm actually going to pass these next 2 questions over to you as well, Director Brown. When will teachers and other school staff be vaccinated, and will staff be required to be vaccinated in the new school year?
So I recognize that vaccinations is certainly what we look to every day. We find out about new sites that are opening and shipments arriving at Pearson, and we're watching that very closely because that's the hope that we have for a return to normality and being able to be with one another again. Our hope for, first of all, education workers, and we've been pushing really hard with the ministry to prioritize our staff. Our staff have been serving students in communities since September, really being out there every day, being as safe as possible, trying to make sure that students have a great experience in person. And even specifically with some of our staff when we were in lockdown in January and February, some of our teachers who serve students with special needs, coming in every day to make sure that those students and families were served. And with that in mind, we really pushed the government on the idea that our education staff, our teachers, support staff, administrators, everyone who's serving students need to be prioritized in the vaccination line. So in a lot of ways that was helpful because we were named in education staff as part of phase 2. So right now that is scheduled for the beginning of June. So essentially they're still going through some age categories, but in the first couple of weeks of June is right now what's scheduled for education staff to be vaccinated. And it's our hope during that time that every staff member who wishes to receive a vaccination will be able to get one in that window. Having said that, we recognize some of those frontline staff that work with some of our most vulnerable students very intimately with some of our highly complex students. We recognize the importance of getting them a vaccination as soon as possible. We continue to press the ministry on this. We do hope to be able to provide them access even sooner. And in doing so, I really want to acknowledge our trustees. Our Board of Trustees just passed a resolution, a board motion last Thursday night, sending an official letter off to the government to continue to advocate for education staff to be prioritized in the vaccination process. So really appreciative of the leadership of our trustees in this work, and we appreciate their support and their advocacy. So for sure, during the beginning of June for education workers, as per the current plan, we're sincerely hoping that we can actually move that up a little bit quicker for staff, particularly some of our special education staff and those who serve those staff members. The second question, Shazia, was about requirements for students or staff?
For staff, whether it will be mandatory.
Right now, we are sincerely hopeful that everyone who is eligible to receive a vaccine will choose to do so. And that is the expectation that the more in our community and certainly in our schools who are vaccinated, the safer our schools are. So we highly encourage our staff to do so when it's their turn to do so. Right now, it's not a requirement that any individual do so, but we continue to work with all of our staff members and our partners to make sure that we are providing opportunities for staff to do so. And we hope that all staff will take advantage of the opportunity when the time comes.
Thank you. Steve, can you tell us how much funding the provincial government has given the board to help with COVID-related expenses?
Thank you very much for the question, Shazia. So we had a couple of different sources of funding for COVID specifically from the provincial government. One, they provided us around $16.5 million one-time funding for things like ventilation, HVAC, computers, and so forth. That was provided at the beginning of the year. They also provided what they called enrollment stabilization funding. So I mentioned this year that we'd lost some students, but we haven't cut staffing. The reason we were able to do that, partially at least, was because the government basically kept the funding level the same this year and didn't reduce it to the actual enrollment levels that we got this year. But again, we're based on our conversation with the minister, we're not expecting that for next year. So we had those two pockets of money. The enrollment stabilization funding was around $22.7 million, I believe. So within that range. So there's a substantial amount of money this year.
Thanks so much. Next question. If there is virtual learning offered next year, will there be additional training provided to teachers in order to ensure they're proficient and comfortable with using the necessary applications? Over to you, Dan.
Thanks, Shazia. Definitely. I think even this year, when we first moved to virtual remote learning back in March of last year, our first priority was to ensure that our staff was very much had the capacity to deliver a well-rounded program remotely to all of our students. So our students our curriculum department continues to offer PD sessions with best practices related to teaching in a virtual environment. So we even had exemplary lessons that we posted with using our resource staff. We've had individual PD sessions for groups of teachers as well. So we plan to continue that if there is remote, and our feeling is that there will be some type of remote learning. And so we'll continue to provide the professional development for our teaching staff and our support staff as well.
Thanks so much. There's a question here. I think this is directed to Director Brown. I keep seeing news stories about another lockdown. I'm worried this year is a write-off for my child and they're missing crucial learning time. What's the board's plan?
We keep seeing the same news stories that you are, and we're trying to stay as closely connected to the ministry as we can, closely connected to TPH and the Ministry of Health. We meet with TPH daily. We meet as a senior team regularly to discuss what's happening throughout the system. And we see the same as you do, some of the rising case counts throughout the system, throughout Toronto. We recognize that as community cases rise, certainly they do rise in schools, but I would be remiss if I didn't continue to acknowledge that as case counts have risen, we are not surprised that they do rise in our schools, and we do have schools. I acknowledge that we do have schools that are closed. But I also acknowledge that because of the work of staff, our cases are much lower than you would expect given how quickly they rise in the community. So a huge kudos to the work that staff are doing in every school throughout the system to keep our students safe. But hearing about a potential lockdown, again, certainly we pay close attention as well, staying really connected. And as soon as our commitment to you is, as soon as we know, we will be communicating with our community as directly as possible. There's a lot of talk about Easter weekend, people gathering, certainly talk about the Easter break and the concerns around hospitals. So what I want to be clear about is that when it comes to the ministry making a decision in this regard, it really is more closely tied to the medical advice they're given. So it's definitely connected to the case counts in hospitals, what the capacity is in the emergency rooms, how they're rising, and how the healthcare system is able to deal with how cases are rising. That's going to be the real key decision point that will help to inform the ministry, and the ministry will continue to make decisions. As of right now, we're still planning to be in school and serving our students and communities for all the days that are currently on the calendar, but we are paying close attention to what's happening from a case count perspective. And so stay tuned for that with the daily announcements that the government makes. The second part of that question was about the loss of learning. And that's something that we are very concerned about as well and very plugged into. We do have a team that's finalizing details on intervention strategy plan throughout the system, but it's really looking at how we can target students that really need that intervention, need opportunities to make sure that we are honing in on making up for the perception of learning loss, as I think the question said. So we're looking at that in the spring and then into the summer is what that might look like, different opportunities for families to take advantage of, all very much intentionally focused on what are our students' needs and how can we make sure that we are helping to, if there are gaps, close those gaps as best we can. I mean, this has been an unprecedented year, and we recognize that we are just kind of getting to understand the impacts. but we're doing so with our eyes open, very intentionally looking at the ways in which we can lean in to identify what student needs are and have ways in which we can support in the spring and into the summer. So those plans are coming soon, and we look forward to sharing very intentionally.
Thanks so much. I actually saw a couple more questions just before you started answering that related to the learning loss that may be occurring in this school year and whether or not there's going to be funding provided in the spring and summer. So we will update our FAQs on our budget consultation page so everyone will have access to that response. Moving along here, there's a question, Steve, I'm going to pass this to you. How does the board decide what to do with reserve funds? How can schools and teacher groups become more involved in the process and propose other areas of need for future reserves?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question, Shazia. So actually a couple of years ago, we set up what we call a reserve policy. And that reserve policy really dictates how the reserves are allocated. Again, reserves, just so everyone's on the same page, reserves are small, we'll call small pockets of money that were built up over time as a result of maybe being under budget one year or something to that effect. We have a contingency reserve as an example, which we use for sort of the in-year purposes in case we have fluctuations in our expenditures that we haven't necessarily accounted for. And then there's other reserves for other things, such as there's an equity reserve as an example. There's the trustees have a playground reserve that we allocate towards building new playgrounds, a small reserve, relatively speaking, to the size of the system. So those are things that are, again, managed through our reserve policy, and we review those policies on a regular basis with our board of trustees. So any feedback that you might have would probably be best through the trustees, and when we go through the policy of updating that policy, the process of updating that policy is when we would look at what changes might need to be done for that.
Thanks so much. Okay, this next question is related to teacher librarians. There's quite a bit of text here, so I'm gonna read the entire thing. And I'm not sure yet who I'm gonna be passing this one on to. So the question starts, library learning commons and teacher librarians have the potential to support equity and literacy initiatives like no other space or role in a school. Teacher librarians impact schools in profound ways and play an essential role in bridging gaps in achievement and access for all students, especially marginalized students, students with special needs, and English language learners. Knowing how important equity and 21st century learning initiatives are to the board, and that many schools do not have teacher librarian or only have a part-time TL, how does the board plan to improve TL staffing and sections? I'm going to give that to Dan.
Thanks, Shazia. Yes, teacher librarians are significant, and this would be only at the secondary level. We use library technicians at our elementary level. And again, there's a formula for staffing based on the number of students. So it again is enrollment driven, and that determines the amount of staff. That's not to minimize the role that teacher librarians play. I know in many secondary schools, there's significant asset between the partnership and the collaboration that exists between the library teacher and the classroom teacher and the work that's being done to support student achievement. So we want to enhance that collaboration. We want to enhance that partnership that exists because the expertise that they provide and the knowledge around the literacy, around the numeracy, around the tech pieces as well that are available, that research that comes in to the library and their expertise is instrumental in improving student achievement. But again, that doesn't mean that there's not going to be any reductions. Again, we're enrollment based. So depending upon the number of students, and we're hoping that all of the students that may have left or not registered, because many of the declining enrollment was in kindergarten, obviously. We're hoping that all of those families decide to return come September in a safe environment for their children. But any students, whether they be at the high school level, we want to increase the enrollment. If we increase the enrollment, we can increase the number of support staff like teacher librarians, like special education, just the teaching group that's outside of the regular classroom.
Thanks so much, Dan. The next question is related to budget survey questions. In recent years, the budget survey has come out with the same staff positions listed year after year, and respondents are given the impossible task of ranking positions in order of importance, yet all are vital to student success. Can more or different areas be included? Why are the same positions questioned and not others? I'm going to pass that to Steve.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. And certainly as we're preparing the budget survey this year, we have been looking at the questions to make sure that they're as effective as possible. We do ask a couple of ranking questions, and it is a very difficult task. It's a difficult task from a budgetary perspective as well, and there's some tough choices that we have to make, and that's why we ask the questions that we do ask. The pie is only so big, so to speak, and we have to decide how to slice that pie up, so to speak. I will say that we did look at the questions this year, and we made sure that they're representative of all the different roles and positions, if you will, throughout the system. And we also asked some other questions as well. And we've also tried to make an effort to make that question a little bit easier to answer for folks this year. So hopefully there'll be a better experience for everybody this year when the survey gets released tomorrow.
Thank you. Next question. Is there virtual learning offered? If there is virtual, sorry, I think I asked this question already. My apologies. Here we go. Given the lower student enrollments and possible move to virtual learning, is the board considering any school closures or amalgamation of schools? I'm going to pass that to Director Brown.
Thanks. I would start off by saying really proud of the ways in which we staff really up to how we're funded, and we recognize that there are a lot of schools in the system where there's some lower numbers, and there's schools in the system in which we are just bursting. I'm very proud of that. The short answer is when it comes to specific to amalgamations or school closures, the short answer is no. And the reason why is because there's a moratorium on any sort of school closure process. So any school board can go through what's called an accommodated review process, or an ARC process. And that really goes through the process of taking a look in underutilized schools. And we've done that in Toronto Catholic many different times for different reasons when it comes to declining enrollment. However, at the moment, based on provincial mandate, there's a moratorium on any such processes. So we actually legislatively are not able to do so, look at closing schools at the moment. When that is changed from a ministry perspective, we are always looking at how we can be efficient and use our funds and our spaces to the best we can. Also being thoughtful about communities and making sure that we're working in partnership with communities, recognizing that schools is the heartbeat of many of our communities, and ways in which we can increase their vibrancy is what we want to continue to focus on now. But in the short term, looking at next year, amalgamations and closures are not on the table at the moment.
Thanks so much. Just being mindful of time here. I have no idea how it just sped right through. It's 7:20. We have about 10 more minutes with everyone. Have a number of questions that I still want to get through. So Director Brown, I might keep the next two. I'm going to try to bundle them for you here. If staffing is tied to enrollment, what is the TCDSB doing to increase enrollment? What is the school board doing to improve student enrollment? What is the reasoning for a loss of over 3,500 students?
So the reason for the loss, first of all, the reason for the loss of 3,500 students, this is a provincial phenomenon. So there's a question we were asked yesterday, and I regretted not being able to answer it this way, because the question came at last night's town hall that said, are students going to private schools or going to public system? And the answer is no. Our coterminous board is experiencing a proportionally same decrease in enrollment as our boards throughout the province. So some of that is connected to just the birth rate for a while. We actually we have long-term projections on that. And when we look at our projections over the next 10 years, we will be tracking up again. So we're kind of in a dip now. We anticipated that dip to some extent. But the biggest hit actually was around the pandemic. And as was referenced a couple times already, many of our students that we anticipated, and that many of them who had registered and didn't show up in September, were our kindergarten students. The Education Act requires that students register for school by the age of 6. So that's grade 1. So kindergarten, JK and SK are actually optional. And many families know that. And when it came to the pandemic, recognizing that we didn't, many families didn't know what school was going to look like. They had a 4 or 5-year-old thinking about them possibly being online all day. They decided to keep them home. So that is also consistent with other boards across the province as well. So number one, there is a bit of a decrease in school age students at the moment across the province. Number two, we definitely think the pandemic has changed some decision-making processes for families, many of which being in the younger years, and we do hope to get some of those back. How do we increase enrollment is really by promoting the excellence of our system, the ways in which our staff go above and beyond and create opportunities for students to be the best version of themselves. The reputation that we have as a beacon of excellence here in Toronto and a beacon of excellence for Catholic education is something that we're extremely proud of. People choose to come to Toronto Catholic. We're very proud of the fact that parents and families register with us when they have choice and they don't have to. They can register in the public system, they can register in the French system, but they come and they choose a Catholic education because we believe that we provide excellence when it comes to faith formation, when it comes to community, and when it comes to academic achievement. So increasing enrollment is really increasing public confidence in the ways in which when you choose Catholic education, you're choosing excellence. You're choosing an opportunity for your son or daughter to be with others who have similar values that are going to go through the system and have opportunities to leave us and go on to do amazing things. We love to promote our alumnus. We love to promote the ways in which our students are prepared to take on the real world problems that we're preparing them for. And we believe that when we have that approach to excellence and when we promote it and talk about it, the families continue to choose Toronto Catholic as a place for their children. So that's ways in which we are thoughtful about promoting the work that we do. We try to get out into communities. We try to make sure that people know about their local Catholic schools through promotion, through connecting in churches, through connecting with community centers and programs, all the ways in which we want people to come to us, because once they do, they recognize that they've chosen excellence. And then that ends up promoting and supporting our enrollment growth. So we look forward to the future as a result by taking that approach.
Thank you. So we're going to try to get through just a few more questions before we move on to the closing remarks. There's a question here related to IL instructors. Can you please explain what the requirements are when hiring international language instructors? Over to you, Dan.
Yeah, thanks, Shazia. Yeah, we do. There is a specific interview process that we utilize for IL instructors. Obviously, the minimum is that they be proficient in the language in which they're going to be instructing. They are instructors, so they're not necessarily certified teachers, although many of them are certified teachers as well. But a minimum would be that they have a proficiency in the language, university educated as well. So that's the minimum. I know many of them are obviously we're looking for those other characteristics. One, that they follow the Catholic ethos and are follow the Catholicism, obviously, because they're working with our Catholic students. So that's integral, but also that they have a passion for the language. That's been extremely important. And what my witness in working with the international language instructors is they have a definite passion. They're very concerned about pedagogy and delivering the program in a manner that's appropriate for the age level and the language acquisition of those children. And they're very dedicated to their profession. I know many of them meet on their own and discuss the teaching styles, the best teaching practices that they can implement. And I know in many communities, I always think back to going to St. Francis de Sales and seeing their I believe it was a Spanish language competition, was outstanding. The community was totally engaged. The instructors were extremely professional and passionate about what they were doing and the work that they were doing with their students. So yes, we want to hire the best. We want to make sure that they're proficient in the language and their pedagogy is sound as well.
Thanks so much, Dan. Okay, I think we have time for, it's going to be rapid fire, maybe 2 quick questions here. Next one is for Adrian. There have been OT shortages over the past few years and a shortage of qualified French teachers to teach our French immersion programs. What's the board doing to address this?
Thank you for the question, Shazia. With regards to OT shortage, I mean, I think I alluded to it earlier. The HR department is committed to a sustained recruitment effort in terms of advertising, connecting with all of our faculties of education, and making sure that all of our faculties of education and the talented occasional teachers know that the TCDSB is aggressively hiring and interested in the services of occasional teachers. Occasional teachers are the foundation for our permanent cadre of teachers, and it's incumbent upon us to make sure that we get as many of them into the door. We have a wonderful new teacher induction program that supports them, and getting them into our 190 plus school communities is the gift that we want to give them. With regards to the French program, can you restate that question, please?
Yeah, it was, what is the board doing to support the hiring of French teachers?
Yeah, the French recruitment is basically, it basically falls in line with all of our recruitment efforts. Cognizant of the need that's a provincial dilemma and arguably a national dilemma in terms of shortage of French teachers, we're exhausting every opportunity and channel in terms of reaching out. Our recruitment efforts are connected with all of the faculties of education directly. Our marketing efforts are out there in terms of the need, given the breadth of our French programming that encompasses both immersion, extended French, and core French. Given the shortages and the dilemma that's been acknowledged by the provincial and federal governments, we've had to be creative. Just to be honest with you, we've looked at things like retirees, bringing back retirees, bringing back uncertifieds and supporting uncertifieds, and bringing in some creative initiatives like experiential software, like SMASH programs to support the development of our core French at St. Anne. So we are looking at every opportunity, as well as looking at summer institutes where we're inviting our core French teachers to enhance their language proficiency, to encourage them to take on jobs in the area of immersion or extended as well. So it goes back to Dan's point. We want passionate French educators. It's a critical program within our board, and our recruitment efforts are sustained.
Thanks so much, Adrian. Maria, you're going to have the second last question here. Are the costs of assessing children for special needs covered by the 2020-21 budget so that assessment, IPRCs, and placements can be completed on time this year?
Thank you, Shazia. With respect to our assessments and IPRCs, these are ongoing throughout the year. We continually assess students, and then through the SPSLT process, we recognize there are new students whose names come forward after team meetings. And similarly with IPRCs, once the assessments are complete and those families are invited to the IPRC meeting, those meetings can take place. And that list will follow completion of assessments. So those are ongoing throughout the year. We do have staff who are in place who are both facilitating the assessments and the IPRC meetings. We do recognize that we had a closure last year for quite an extended period of time, and it did interrupt some of our processes. And this year, although we did have some time of closure, we have worked to ensure that we're taking advantage where possible of virtual means to enable meetings to take place. And our goal, of course, is to work diligently on any assessments that are outstanding and to, in a timely manner, bring those students to IPRC. Typically at the end of the year, there are students who are still in anticipation of an assessment, and those assessments then roll over to the next year. And the staff who are in place and through the special services continue to work on addressing those needs.
Thanks so much, Maria. I know we waited for folks to join the session, so we started 2 minutes late, so I'm going to try to quickly buy that time, but I'm going to get through 2 more questions. So Steve, the last 2 are for you. The first one is, it's not clear whether virtual school is fully funded for the 2021-22 school year, and can you tell us which staffing positions are not covered by provincial funding?
Thank you, Shazia, for the question. In terms of the virtual school, for next year. Again, I think the key element there, unfortunately, is we're still waiting for some announcements from the ministry in terms of what specific funding there will be for virtual learning. This year, there was a little bit of funding for virtual learning, and it covered mostly the sort of administrative costs of running the school. The staffing was all based on our typical staffing models, so it was all part of our general budget. We moved staff around based on the enrollment in virtual learning versus the in-person side of things. In terms of overall funding from a government perspective, what programs are funded and so forth, again, I think there's a bit of sometimes a misunderstanding there in terms of how we're funded. There's a funding model, a formula that drives the revenues for us, and there's different calculations in there based on different parts of the funding formula. It gets quite complex, but not all parts of our funding is related to a specific program or course or something to that effect. The government will typically put parameters around some of that funding, but not all the funding is directed towards individual expenses. And this is where we talk about flexible funding. And this is part of the reason, again, why we're going through the process of consulting with the community, understanding where the priorities should be for next fiscal year, and trying to divvy up the funds that we do get from the government to support students in the best possible way that we can. So thank you very much for the question.
Thanks so much, Steve. And thank you to all of our panelists for being here with us today to answer the questions that we received in advance as well as in real time. Want to thank Director Brown and again, all of the panelists for being here today. Want to thank everyone for joining us this evening and for submitting your questions. We hope you'll join us at our third and final town hall, which will be focused around facilities, and that will be taking place on Tuesday, April 20th. It'll be the same time as today, so it'll be 6 o'clock to 7:30. Also, there will be a Zoom webinar link, and also it'll be live on YouTube. You can find that information by going onto our main website. At the very top, you'll see rotating images. You'll see one for budget. You click that, and you'll be able to access all of the information. You'll also be able to access last night and this evening's recorded sessions in case you want to review that again. Again, please submit your questions in advance if you can for the April Town Hall. You can send us an email with your question at comdept@tcdsb, or you can send it directly to our Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook accounts. Tomorrow, I just want to remind everyone, you'll be receiving a link which will take you to the budget survey. It will be open tomorrow until the 30th of April, so please look out for that. You'll also have an opportunity, if you'd like, to delegate at one of our upcoming board meetings on a matter related to the budget, and you can find information about that as well on our website. So just want to thank everyone again. I hope you have a happy and safe Easter.